Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today because I get to talk to Dr. Aaron Eddens about his book titled Seeding Empire, American Philanthrocapital and the Roots of the Green Revolution in Africa, which has just come out from the University of California Press. And this is, I think, a really interesting book that connects a whole bunch of things that maybe we don't always connect. Thinking about agriculture in the US, thinking about the, quote, green revolution in Africa, thinking about how all these things have to do with capitalism, about laws, about philanthropy, about technology, about science. There's a whole lot brought together here to help us take a more critical look at the green revolution. So, Aaron, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast.
Thanks, Miranda. It's really great to be here, and I appreciate the generous introduction.
Well, speaking of introductions, could you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and especially why you decided to write this book?
Sure. So I am an American Studies scholar. I did my PhD at the University of Minnesota. I currently teach at Grand Valley State University in West Michigan, U.S., and I teach in a global studies program. And the story of the book really goes back to my early years as a graduate student at Minnesota. And I was fortunate, it was actually in my first semester at grad school, I was fortunate enough to be part of a faculty seminar at the Institute for Advanced Study, a wonderful resource at the University of Minnesota that I went on to have some great time with later on in my grad school career. But this first semester, this faculty seminar was organized by Rachel Sherman in sociology and Valentine Cadieux in geography. And I want to just start by expressing gratitude to both of them, but especially to Rachel, who passed away this March. And we're actually, as we're getting ready to, as we're recording this, we're getting ready to celebrate Rachel's life this week, actually. So in celebrating the book and talking to people about the book, I've been remembering all the mentorship that I got from Rachel. So I just want to start by expressing gratitude. So anyway, back to the story. I was part of this faculty seminar at the IAS, and we were taking on big questions about the politics of feeding the world, and with historians, sociologists, scholars from across the university, and bringing in guest speakers. And we were taking a really critical look at this narrative of the Green Revolution, this kind of mainstream account of U.S.-led development during the Cold War, that, as the kind of mainstream account has it, staved off famine across Asia, and went on to be a success story that kind of drove future agricultural development. So we're reading really critical appraisals of the Green Revolution. And at the same time, the university archives have put on an exhibit around the revolution, the Green Revolution's central figure, that would, eventually become a central figure to my book. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this figure. But this is Norman Borlaug, who worked at the University of Minnesota and developed a variety of wheat in the 1960s that catalyzed widespread increases in yields for wheat, especially in India and Pakistan. And by doing this, he was really celebrated for his feats. And he kind of became the central figure of the Green Revolution. So at the same time that we're reading critical appraisals by historians and social scientists that really critique a lot of I think convincingly critique a lot of the story around Borlaug in the first Green Revolution, I got the chance to see some of the historical narratives and this sort of mythology around Borlaug at this showcase of his work at the University Archives was putting on. I think the exhibit was called something like "Roots of the Minnesota Roots of the Green Revolution," and it's really struck me that aside from a few parts of the exhibit that detailed Borlaug's endorsement of the notorious agrochemical DDT, most of the account was really celebratory about what Borlaug had done. So I was immediately kind of struck early on in my graduate career by this disconnect between what the historical scholarship on the Green Revolution said, but also kind of what the mainstream accounts were. And at this very same time that I'm seeing this disconnect, this was in 2011. The Gates Foundation had ramped up their efforts to catalyze a green revolution for Africa and bringing lots of agribusiness development to the continent. And in doing so, and this is the story that I used to start the book, would eventually use to start the book, Bill Gates called on the story of Norman Borlaug and the original Green Revolution. And so I was really struck by this, like I said, this disconnect between the historical assessments and the scholarly assessments of this history, and then the way that it was used as a overwhelming success story by everyone from Bill Gates to Barack Obama to the director of the World Bank and so on and so forth. And so really early on, that kind of that sort of got my interest in digging into the power of history and the power of narratives in this story. I started off really looking more at the historical side, digging into some archives around the original Green Revolution and start in Mexico. And then actually spurred on by Rachel, I was encouraged to interview some people that were working on contemporary projects. And I ended up getting great access to talk to people working on projects in Africa. And that kind of drove the rest of the project from then on.
Thank you for giving us that backstory of the project. I'm not surprised to hear that it was fueled by coming across a disconnect. I think that's often how we get really interesting books, by someone going, hang on a second, I'm hearing this and I'm hearing that, and they don't quite match up. I need to go investigate further. So can we kind of, before we get into the answers that you came up with doing this investigation, can you tell us perhaps a bit more about sort of, you've given us the backstory, right, of what the disconnect is, where it's coming from, how you came across it. Obviously, that's not, that might be where a book starts, but that's not where we get to by the time it's published and on people's desks. It has to be refined and clarified and thought through goodness knows how many times. And of course, as academics, we usually frame this in terms of questions. So what questions did you get to and decide to ask and figure out in what became the book? And can you take us through kind of that stage of development of your thinking?
Sure. So the sort of starting with trying to break down and deconstruct the way in which the Gates Foundation in particular was using the success narrative of the Green Revolution to drive its development efforts. That's really where I started with the questions. So they became sort of broad questions like, what is it about this earlier story that becomes so compelling and useful for the Gates Foundation and also the U.S. government in driving new development efforts? What does this narrative obscure? What does it hide? What does it avoid? And what are the specific, both in terms of like material connections, but also ideas, what are the connections across this longer history? Like, what does it do? How does it help us better think through the contemporary politics of all of the development in and around the Green Revolution for Africa? How do we better approach that, thinking historically and drawing out connections? So each of the book's chapters start with that premise and draw out connections between the, thinking kind of in terms of the historical present of this Green Revolution.
Okay, so this is very useful, of course, to guide the rest of our discussion. But before we get into the answers you came up with to these questions, you mentioned before the archival work and the interviews. Can you tell us a bit more about the methods and sources you got to pursue?
Sure. So as an American studies scholar, I was interested in thinking about this both in terms of a contemporary project and a historical project. So I looked at early records of the Green Revolution, in particular the Rockefeller Foundation's sponsored efforts in Mexico, where Norman Borlaug worked through the 1940s through 1960s in particular. Then I, at the same time, was interested in kind of thinking through some of the contemporary dynamics of Green Revolution for Africa projects. Now, it should be said, this is a really broad and kind of overarching set of projects, and I work hard to not reduce it to a singular thing. There are different dynamics based on the development agency sponsoring a project, the companies involved, the country that it's in, the crop that's being grown. But the primary crop that's driving development efforts in the Green Revolution is maize, or corn, as we say in the West. I became especially interested in some of these large-scale development efforts funded by the Gates Foundation to produce genetically modified maize seeds in the context of the climate crisis. And these maize seeds were modified to be more drought tolerant. And so I approached a few people. So the primary project that I look at and I write about in the book was called Water Efficient Maize for Africa. And it was a public-private partnership between the Monsanto company, the biotech giant, and the largest public sector international maize institution, known by its Spanish acronym CIMMYT. And so this was a partnership between the Monsanto company and CIMMYT that was trying to develop maize. I think when it started off, it was in 5 East and Southern African countries, and it's expanded and it's sort of still happening, but under a different name and different stages of the project. But I started asking people that were involved in this project, and my sort of inroad into the project was about asking about the dynamics and the kind of what was changing about development and science around the dynamics of the public-private partnership. So how were things changing when the public sector scientists were working with the intellectual property of Monsanto, and what was changing for Monsanto when they were partnering more with public sector scientists. And because I think because I was asking a lot of these sort of technical science studies type of questions, I really got great access, and I was fortunate enough to be able to speak to people kind of across this project, and spent some time in Nairobi, and did interviews across a range of the institutions that were involved, but primarily with the Gates Foundation, the CIMMYT, the public sector scientists, and Monsanto, and then also this organization called the African Agricultural Technology Foundation, which was set up to sort of help broker these types of partnerships between Western biotech companies and both governments and public sector research institutions, as well as seed companies in Africa. So those were the 2 primary methods that I drew on. I also do some more cultural studies type analysis where I bring in some like a documentary film or some contemporary biographies of Borlaug, for example. But primarily I look at interview-based research and the archival work.
Very helpful to give us that overview. There's a bunch of things there I'm going to ask you about as we go further. But as a kind of starting point, that's quite helpful. I want to sort of make sure that we bring something into the conversation that I think you and I both know is very much there. But let's make sure it's explicit for the listeners as well. A lot of what you've just talked about are words that we kind of expect to go together, right? Private-public partnership, philanthropy, technology, public sector, corporate. Those are all words that we're not surprised to kind of see in the same word cloud. But the book is called Seeding Empire, right? which is not always a word that we would think could kind of fit in with discussions around private public seed scientific research. So can you talk us through the ways in which you find empire to be actually quite a useful analytical framework to examine the Green Revolution?
Sure. And that was actually one of my driving questions, I think, throughout the book was a lot of several other important historical works that I'm building on in the book by historians such as Nick Cullither, Tori Olson, and others have traced the deep entanglements between U.S. foreign policy and Green Revolution development projects, in particular the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation's efforts that Norman Borlaug's work was a part of during the Cold War. And so that was it. People look back and kind of understand the first Green Revolution as tied, and part of U.S. empire. But there were less direct connections being drawn out between the newer iteration of Green Revolution and the projects happening now kind of under the banner of Green Revolution. And the way you phrased it as, empire as an analytical framework is really what I'm trying to get at here. I wanted to kind of get away from thinking in terms of this kind of like capital E empire that subsumes everything, or empire as a noun, that everything can be traced back to U.S. power. It's not really like that with the story I'm trying to tell. There are, in certain instances, times when U.S. power and kind of what we might think of as capital E U.S. empire matters and is very much part of the story. But there are other times when I'm thinking more in terms of empire as a process, and empire as something that shapes how we understand history, empire as it's related to narratives around development, and separating the world into, frontiers of undeveloped space versus the developers and the improvers. And so in particular, kind of building on other historians that have looked at and tried to draw out connections between the project of settler colonialism and the U.S., and then what we think of as more U.S. kind of overseas empire, and trying to draw out connections between the two in terms of both, material processes and also ideas that underpin settler colonialism and overseas empire. The project is looking at the ways in which kind of narratives that are deeply rooted in settler colonialism continue to drive development projects. So, and also thinking in terms of, well, where do we find connections between U.S. power and philanthrocapitalism, or what the Gates Foundation is doing, the Gates Foundation's approach to development, because it's not always as clear and on the surface as it was in the at the height of the previous Green Revolution, when the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation had really direct ties to U.S. foreign policy. It's a bit more under the surface now, but I think is still a really useful set of questions to ask around U.S. power and Green Revolution development.
No, absolutely. And in fact, it's exactly on that point of being under the surface, but there if you look, that I'd love to move to next. If we kind of go back to the disconnect you initially had noticed and prompted all of this, the dominant narrative, not the scholarly one, but the one that showed up in that exhibition about Norman Borlaug, what is that story that, as you said, is still being used, pretty recently? Definitely not just during the Cold War. This is something, as you mentioned, was being talked about in 2011. What is this narrative teaching American audiences in particular about international agricultural developments, about American policy, about American involvement in these things? What is the story that's a little bit under the surface, but very much there?
Right. Yeah, and the narrative really, and this is something that continues to drive the book, or my thinking around the book, is that the narrative remains remarkably unscathed. And one of the examples is it, I talk about both a recent biography of Borlaug and also a 2020 film that was part of the public television PBS American Experience series. And they did this, they tried to kind of strike a balance, critique of Borlaug. But the story they told was, Borlaug did in fact feed the world, but there were some unintended consequences. And even though they interviewed a number of historians that were quite critical of the Borlaug success story, they managed to kind of frame it in terms of it was an overwhelming success. So for listeners that are perhaps not as familiar with the story of the Green Revolution, basically it's kind of a reduction to a story about kind of scientific ingenuity overcoming what was feared at the time of like a Malthusian famine, right? So there were all these, there was widespread worry in the 1960s about population concerns. There were best-selling books written about the soon impending doom of global famines, in particular in Asia, and Borlaug's work brought lots of developing this higher yielding variety of wheat that was then transported and taken up across India and Pakistan in particular to kind of launch what became the Green Revolution projects in the late 1960s. Did in fact catalyze large yields, but there are all these contradictions that again have been, readily laid out by historians and social scientists over the years. Things like, the fact that the Green Revolution, the countries where the Green Revolution was most active, still suffer from large amounts of hunger and inequality, to kind of the environmental implications, to the ways that the development efforts catalyzed through Borlaug's efforts led to certain smaller numbers of farmers kind of taking more land, gaining more control. So there are all these contradictions. But again, the success narrative that continues to be celebrated especially around this hero figure, Norman Borlaug. And I don't know if I mentioned, but Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. And that kind of cemented his position as kind of a hero figure in this development story. But this hero narrative really obscures not only these contradictions, but also the ways in which Borlaug's projects were deeply entangled with U.S. foreign policy and the geopolitics of the day, and other things happening. So, one of the things I talk about in the book, for example, is, Borlaug gave this speech when he received the Nobel Peace Prize that kind of reduced the Green Revolution to a story about science overcoming the Malthusian population monster. But he didn't talk about what was happening at the same time with the U.S. war in Vietnam, or the different conflicts that were happening and around the Cold War. So all of the historical and geopolitical complexities are kind of pushed to the side and continue to be pushed to the side. And so that was one of the things that I found so interesting and kind of drove my interest in digging into this project over the years, was that the kind of convenient way the Borlaug hero narrative served the interest of contemporary agribusiness or philanthropist development organizations to sort of, and brushing aside the different questions around power and history.
Yeah, so can you tell us a bit more about that? Like, why is it useful for these particular actors to have this oversimplified story? What do they get out of it?
Well, I think they get a justification for their expansion projects, or for their goal, whether it's a corporate agribusiness company or the Gates Foundation trying to set up development along a particular lines that benefit Western agribusiness in particular. By kind of minimizing or obscuring the different historical and geographical complexities, this becomes a driving narrative that justifies and legitimizes their efforts. And this was something that I saw quite frequently in my own research and my own conversations, was people would talk about, and I was fortunate enough to be, though I was coming from a completely different area of the university, and my field was American Studies, and I was interested in questions of power and history. I was, when I was talking to these scientists, they would say, "Oh, we know about University of Minnesota because of Borlaug," and Borlaug kind of. I was inspired by Borlaug as myself as a graduate student when I got into this, and so on and so forth. And so I think that is it becomes the success narrative sort of legitimizes a particular approach to development, which doesn't always ask questions about unequal power relations or who controls the particular technologies in question, or questions around intellectual property. Some of these other questions that help us better think about power, the success narrative doesn't take those on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So thank you for telling us more about that. I'd love to pick up on that point you just made, though, about intellectual property. Can you talk to us about hybrid seed development and what your book adds to our understanding of this history?
Sure. So just to quick clarify, and I can take this in two different directions, but the intellectual property rights dynamic and the chapter that I have in the book that looks closely at the role of intellectual property rights in these development efforts in East and Southern Africa, around the Water Efficient Maize for Africa project. These are largely around the genetically modified seeds, where the trait that has been genetically modified. So in this case, it was a gene that was developed or sequenced to be more tolerant to drought. So they could insert this gene that came from a certain bacteria into maize, and then that would make the maize produce varieties that were more resistant to drought. And so it was that technology that was actually separate from the seed itself that was the intellectual property. And without getting too technical, the ways that hybrid maize it's a slightly different in terms of property relations. But I think the larger questions around power and control, and what types of knowledge are deemed most useful for development, whereas what types of knowledge are seen as in need of improvement, I think apply to both. So you'd asked about hybrid seeds and what the book looks at in terms of hybrid seeds.
If you want to go in that direction.
Sure. Basically, and again, I want to make sure that I'm getting all of the some of the technical details right, to help listeners that might not be as familiar with agriculture. So the simplest way to explain it is a hybrid seed is developed in a way that farmers don't replant them. So whereas traditionally farmers all over the world have saved seeds and replanted them, a hybrid variety doesn't produce its higher yield is only good for one growing season. So in the history of development in the U.S., for example, starting in the 1930s, the expansion of hybrid seeds really compelled more and more farmers to start buying seeds from seed companies, and it became the central business plan for large seed companies that would go on to become global seed companies, and some of the seed companies that I'm looking at in the book, such as DuPont Pioneer, which famously was Pioneer Hybrid, and Monsanto as well, so the hybrid seed is the central kind of is central to the business plan of these companies. One of the scientists I interviewed one time told me that, he said we joke that the three most important crops for these big companies are maize, maize, and maize. This is where they make their money, and getting farmers to buy new bags of seed. And so one of the things I'm interested in the book is tracing connections between earlier hybrid seed development in historical Green Revolution projects and what's happening in the contemporary development efforts in Africa, which are largely around starting and sort of incubating new hybrid seed companies. So it's not always about the genetically modified seed, which is kind of adds a different layer and is another question, but it's very much around expanding markets and expanding development efforts for or expansionary efforts for seed companies.